My next guest is Congressman Steve Stivers. Representative Stivers was just elected to his sixth term in Congress, so congratulations to him. He's been serving as a member of the House Financial Services Committee throughout his congressional career, overseeing banking, insurance, real estate, and public and assisted housing. Congressman Stivers, great to talk to you again. Congrats on the re-election. Right now, today, we're talking about essentially the housing world, how it fits in the economy. And as you kind of look out there and you look at the affordability of building homes out there today and kind of dealing with this as a piece of the economy during a COVID crisis, what's on your map?
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the chance to chat about housing. Housing is a very important part of our economy. And the way I see it, there are really three things on the list to deal with regard to housing. First is issues related to the COVID crisis. We have a lot of renters, both commercial renters and residential renters, who are having a hard time affording their properties. And the good news is we've seen the forbearance rates of mortgages go down, but we're hearing anecdotally that the late rent has not gotten any better. And frankly, the data is very spotty, because the data that we're getting from the National Multifamily Housing Council shows that this year, 2020, is a lot like 2019. We all know that's not necessarily true. I think that's skewed because the National Multifamily Housing Council is mostly the bigger renters that rent to maybe a little more financially sophisticated residential borrowers, or residential renters. So, and we've seen the commercial space have big issues with rent for restaurants, bars, and a lot of other small businesses that have been impacted by the economy. So the issue number one is getting COVID related rental assistance, potentially temporary rental assistance on the map. Issue number two is what you talked about, and that's affordability. We have an affordability crisis in this country. In fact, in Franklin County, Ohio, the biggest county in my district that includes Columbus, Ohio, we have 50,000 workplace housing units shortage, which means, and affordable housing, workforce housing is the same, sort of two ways of saying the same thing. So we have a 50,000 unit shortage just in Franklin County. When you include the rural parts of my district, we have an even bigger shortage, because rural housing is the other thing that we don't have a good enough policy on. Housing and Urban Development is the department that handles urban housing and suburban housing, but the Department of Agriculture handles rural housing. And there's not a good rural housing policy in this country right now. And so we've got to deal with that. The third thing that I think we've got to deal with and try to figure out is the supply crisis. Right now, there's not a lot of inventory out there for existing homes to sell. And I think a lot of that is, due to COVID and other things like that. But we had that crisis even before COVID, and that's making prices go up of homes. So we need to try to do what we can on the supply crisis as well. And I think that involves trying to encourage home building as well in this country, which after the 2007, 2008 crisis took a pretty big hit.
Congressman, I really appreciate that picture of the sort of map of what the factors are. In my own research for this, just kind of digging in and saying what are some of the issues, it's really interesting that there's a lumber shortage out there right now. You talk about supply chain, you talk about global trade, and you talk about supply and demand. There's just not a lumber out there. Maybe it's because of the fear of the election. A lot of plywood, whatever, disappeared. But my point, whether it's lumber, whether it's mixed use regulations on housing development within cities. I know that many of your constituents think that you control everything in Washington, and I'm sensitive to the fact that I know you don't. But when it comes to these big factors of regulation and housing regulation in cities that can be done, do you think there are models that would be useful to look at that could help deal with that 50,000 unit shortage, or begin looking at ways where the equities in a community are held together? But something's got to give, because there is a huge housing shortage in America today.
Absolutely, Stephen. I think there's two issues around that. We can't necessarily solve the lumber crisis, but a lot of the lumber in the United States comes from Canada. The new United States-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Act should help get that moving again. I hope, and the lumber crisis will solve itself. But what we've seen as we've looked at housing affordability is about 30% of the cost is increased by local building codes. And if we could figure out how to simplify and get some model codes across the country for workforce housing, still making sure we keep it safe and still making sure that the codes are done in a way that encourages quality building, we could cut the price of workforce housing by 30%, which is a giant cut. That's the single biggest driver of the affordability crisis is the local building codes right now.
You know, one of the other things that I think looking forward is a question of infrastructure bills. We've had a lot of things on opportunity zones discussed in the past, and I myself, I'll confess my own ignorance. I don't know to what degree income and money coming in and flow into some of these projects. If a Biden administration comes in and really puts infrastructure out as a possibility, is that another area? Because I'm very sensitive. One other piece of this, which isn't often discussed, is that because of the COVID crisis, new entrants, those people who want to come into the workforce in the housing and building trades area, we're not producing them right now because it's such a hands-on business. And people think, oh, don't worry, we've got a lot of those folks. But there are going to be a couple of years where there's going to be a talent and work deficit. So as you look at the possibilities of an incoming Biden administration, what do you think they've got to get right? What do you think the opportunities are, bipartisan, perhaps, on workforce development and opportunity zones and infrastructure?
Well, and I think you've singled out three things that are very, very important. And we're seeing a graying workforce in the skilled trades, Steve. And I've talked to my building trades in Columbus, Ohio about that. We aren't training enough people in the trades. I think we've got to work on that. We've got an opportunity to do some bipartisan legislation on workforce development. Absolutely. Infrastructure, I think, is a bipartisan opportunity. And when we think about infrastructure, I think about roads and bridges, but I also think about things like rural broadband, because the COVID crisis has very much highlighted the differences of internet access between our urban and suburban communities and then our rural communities a little further out. The rural communities just don't seem to have the same kind of access. And it's because the mid-mile and last-mile programs by the United States government don't work. And I think we need to empower our rural electric cooperatives for the last mile of service. And we need to give some big incentives for mid-mile service to the both the power companies and the telephone companies and the cellular companies for mid-mile, because they'll run that fiber to the mid-mile and then hook it in to the folks who will deliver it on the last mile. So I think we need to rebuild the programs for rural broadband. As we think of infrastructure, we need to think of that as infrastructure, because in the modern economy, an internet connection is just as important as a road or a bridge.
You know, Steve, I really appreciate you framing it that way. You just hit one of my pet interests. I've been to Ohio many times, and I think the number of students in Ohio schools that are not connected to broadband, particularly in the Appalachian part of Ohio, is about 25%. It's a staggeringly large number. And I guess my question is, as we think about broadband, and we also think about homes. I mean, when I was talking to some of our folks involved with today, I said, look, is a home just a roof over your head? Or is it also access to data and learning and opportunities and knowing what's going to happen with the weather and all of these other kinds of things? And so as we think about structures, there's also a digital dimension to that a lot of people are left out of. So I guess my question is to drill down a little bit deeper. What do you need from your colleagues? What do you need from across the aisle to make that issue one that we stop talking about because we've solved it?
Well, I think that's really important. And by the way, you bring up a good point. There's two issues with internet access. One is just the access in the rural areas where they don't have rural broadband access. The other is affordability in the urban areas for people who are of lower socioeconomic means. And we need to figure out how to subsidize their access to data too, because that becomes an educational issue with all the open source content. It becomes a healthcare issue now with telemedicine. It becomes an economic development issue for them being able to get a job. So there's so many things that now rely on the digital economy. So I think we need, number one, we do, I think, have to get rid of the program at the Federal Communications Commission and the one at the Department of Agriculture and start over, because if those programs worked, we wouldn't be talking about this right now. And I think we need to probably put a little more money into it and encourage the private sector. I don't want a government-only solution on this. I want to subsidize the private sector to come in and solve this problem. The problem in the rural areas is that there's not enough density, and so it's going to need to be subsidized. The problem in the urban areas is if people can't afford to pay for it, you're going to have to subsidize it. So there will be some government support required, but if we do it right, we can leverage the private expertise and the private ability to do things efficiently and make it happen. And hopefully we can come to a bipartisan agreement on getting that done and making it happen. Because as I said, the good news is, the urban Democrats care about that inner city group that can't afford it. And the more Republican group cares about the rural folks who don't even have access at any price. So hopefully we can come together with a program that does both and can actually get done.
Thank you for that, Congressman. We're taking questions from the audience, and I've got a question here from Ron Lieberman, who's chairman of the Florida Housing Finance Corporation. Greetings, Ron. Your question.
The Affordable Housing Tax Credit Program has been and is one of the most successful national housing programs, creating tens of thousands of affordable rental units, as well as thousands of jobs and a huge economic benefit to local economies. Years ago, NAHB supported the idea of creating a tax credit program for affordable home ownership. I wondered if there would be an appetite to revisit the concept.
Congressman?
Thanks for that question, Ron. And yeah, I do think that it's time to talk about things like that. And the tax credit program has been one of the most effective means of building low-income housing in this country because it leverages private dollars and does things much more efficiently. And I think everybody acknowledges that it works. And the only question now with corporate tax rates coming down is, are you getting enough bang for your buck? And we may need to do some things there. But I think a home ownership tax credit makes a lot of sense. I'd love to work with you on it. In fact, Lacey Clay and I, the chairman of the Housing Subcommittee, started talking about this, trying to do some things to increase minority home ownership. And this was on the list because, frankly, minority home ownership rates are, a small percentage of the home ownership rates of Caucasian America. So it's really important that we try to fix that, because what it results in, because the home is the biggest investment most people have, is a wealth disparity where minority families don't do as well because they don't have a home to help grow their wealth. And so if we can increase minority home ownership rates or bring them closer, the wealth gap will also get closer. And I think that's better for America to have those type of outcomes more equal. They shouldn't be divided by race or gender.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. When we put this program together today, I was sort of looking at, this notion of what it takes to build a healthy community. What are the economic dimensions? What are the social and citizen dimensions? What are all those pieces that come together synergistically to do that? And I think you've hit nearly every piece that I think about in the building blocks of that. So thanks so much for your candid thoughts today, Congressman Steve Stivers of Ohio. Thank you.
Well, Steve, I really appreciate the chance to be with you. And I look forward to working with everybody. And anybody that's got a pen and pencil handy, please write this number down. My office number is 202-225-2015 in Washington. And you can talk to me, Steve Stivers, or Mimi Bear about your housing issues or priorities. We want to work with you. I'm the ranking Republican on the Housing Subcommittee, and I look forward to working with folks that care. So please feel free to call me. That's why we got a phone.
Thanks you, everybody. He's going to welcome the flood of calls. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us.